He was just fixing her armor. She had other plans. The nebula star drifted silently through the vast expanse of space, its sleek hull reflecting the light of distant stars. A ship built for speed and defense, it carried the hopes of humanity's future on a distant planet. The crew aboard the ship had been through many battles, faced countless dangers, and survived the worst space could throw at them. But this mission was different. It was more personal. Captain Elysia had been the leader of this crew for several years. She was known throughout the galaxy for her strength, her bravery, and her unyielding resolve. No challenge seemed too great for her. The weight of command was something she carried every day, but it was a weight she bore without complaint. However, lately, she felt it growing heavier. The long hours, the constant danger, the never-ending responsibility of keeping her crew alive. It was starting to take its toll on her. Her armor was a symbol of her leadership. It had saved her life in countless battles and made her an icon to the people who followed her. Yet today, it seemed more like a cage. The armor, once a symbol of strength, now felt like a burden. It was battered from the last fight with the alien forces they had encountered, but she didn't mind the damage. She didn't care about how it looked. It was just a piece of metal. What mattered was that it was functional. She had to be ready for whatever came next. Elysia sat quietly in her quarters, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the window. She had seen so many worlds, so many different cultures, and so many battles. But no matter where she went, the loneliness followed. It was a part of leadership, being the one who made the tough decisions, who held the lives of her crew in her hands. But it was also a price she paid for power. People respected her, but they also feared her, and that fear kept them at a distance. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Without turning, she called out, "Enter." The door slid open, and in walked Jace, the ship's technician. He was a quiet, reserved man, more comfortable with machines than people. Jace had been assigned the task of repairing her armor. It was a simple job, one he had done countless times before. But today, there was something different in the air. Jace didn't know it, but this repair would be unlike any other. He stepped into the room, his eyes briefly meeting hers, before quickly shifting to the armor lying on the table.
Elysia didn't move. She didn't offer him a greeting.
She just sat there, lost in her own thoughts. "Captain," Jace said softly, his voice almost a whisper.
"I'm here to fix your armor."
Elysia nodded, not saying a word. She didn't need to speak. Jace had always been quiet, and that suited her just fine. She didn't need someone who would fill the silence with words. She just needed someone who could do their job well. Jace moved towards the table, carefully lifting the damaged pieces of armor. The one's polished surface was now scratched and dented, evidence of the battles they had fought. As he began to work, Elysia remained still, her gaze still focused on the stars.
"How are you holding up?" Jace asked after a few minutes of silence. It was an odd question, one that Elysia didn't expect from someone like him.
Jace wasn't the type to ask about emotions, but there was something in his tone, something sincere that made her pause. "I'm fine," Elysia replied, her voice flat. She didn't want to talk about how she was feeling. She didn't want anyone to see the cracks in her armor, not even Jace. She had to be strong. Always. Jace didn't press her further. He knew better than to ask too many questions. Instead, he focused on his work, carefully adjusting the various pieces of armor. As his hands moved, he couldn't help but notice how damaged the armor was. It was clear that Captain Elysia had been through hell and back. And yet she never showed it. She never let anyone see the weight she carried. For a moment, Jace wondered if anyone ever truly understood what it was like to be in Elysia's shoes, to have the weight of an entire crew's survival on your shoulders, to make decisions that could cost lives, to be the one everyone looked to for answers, even when you didn't have them yourself. It was a loneliness that Jace couldn't imagine. He had his own burdens, his own quiet struggles, but nothing like what Elysia must have endured. He continued to work in silence, but the more he fixed, the more he noticed. The small cracks in her armor seemed to reflect something deeper. It wasn't just the physical damage that needed repair. It was something more.
Alicia was broken, but she wasn't the only one. Everyone on the ship had their own struggles, their own fears.
Yet they all followed her without question, without hesitation. "You don't have to do this alone, you know," Jace said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alicia looked up at him, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't used to people speaking to her like this, like she was just another person, not the leader of the ship. For a moment, she thought about dismissing him, but something about his sincerity made her hesitate. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a strange pull towards him.
Maybe it was the way he saw her, not as a captain, but as a person.
"I don't have a choice," Alicia said softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion.
"This is what leadership is." Jace didn't respond immediately. He knew that argument. He had heard it countless times before from other leaders. But there was something different about Alicia. She wasn't just a leader. She was a person who was struggling, just like everyone else. Jace finished repairing the last of the armor and stood up. He turned to face Alicia, meeting her gaze for a moment before looking down at his hands. "It's all fixed," Jace said quietly, his voice still soft. "But remember, you don't have to carry it all alone." Alicia didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at him for a long moment. And then, without a word, she stood up, picking up her armor. She didn't need to hear more. She didn't need someone to tell her she wasn't alone. She had her crew. She had her mission. That was enough. Jace watched her for a moment before turning to leave. As he walked out of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The captain was more than just a leader. She was someone who was carrying a weight she couldn't share with anyone else. And yet there was something in the way she held herself, something in the way she looked at him, that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was starting to let go of that burden, just a little. Alicia stood in the quiet of her quarters, holding her armor in her hands. The weight of it felt different now, as if it wasn't just a symbol of strength, but a reminder of everything she had been through. The quiet words of Jace echoed in her mind. She didn't have to do this alone. But that was easier said than done. She had always been the one to stand at the front, to take on the hardest tasks, to make the tough calls. It was what she had been trained to do. It was what she had chosen to do. But at that moment, as she stood alone in her room, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe it was time to let someone in. The silence in the room was broken only by the faint hum of the ship's engines. The nebula star drifted onward, its crew moving forward, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long while, Alicia wondered if maybe she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The nebula star glided through the blackness of space, its engines humming steadily, its crew scattered across the ship, each person with a role to play. Yet aboard this ship, in the quiet aftermath of battle, something was shifting, something neither Captain Alicia nor Jace had anticipated. After Jace finished repairing Alicia's armor, the two went their separate ways, but the feeling that lingered in the air between them was undeniable. Alicia, having regained her armor, moved through the corridors of the nebula star with purpose. The ship had been under attack, but now, for the first time in what felt like a long time, she wasn't just wearing armor to protect her body. She was wearing it to protect her heart. Jace, meanwhile, found himself in the ship's tech bay, surrounded by equipment that could keep the nebula star running at peak efficiency. His thoughts were no longer on the work at hand. He was distracted by the events of earlier, the quiet conversation, the soft words Alicia had spoken, and the vulnerability he had seen in her eyes. It wasn't like her to show such a side to anyone, especially not to him. He was just the ship's technician. Yet, somehow, she had let him see a glimpse of something deeper, something that made him want to understand her more. It wasn't long before Jace's curiosity pulled him from his work. The nebula star was in dry dock for repairs after the attack, and the crew had some much-needed time to themselves. Jace decided to take a walk, hoping the quiet of the ship's hallways would clear his mind. He passed the mess hall, the crew lounge, and a few of the training areas. But his feet took him to the one place he hadn't expected, Captain Alicia's quarters. It was a strange feeling, being near her quarters. On the Nebula Star, the captain's quarters were off limits, unless there was an urgent matter. But the closer he got, the more he felt something pulling him. He stood outside her door for a moment, unsure of what he was doing. But before he could turn back, the door slid open, and he was face to face with Alicia. She looked as surprised as he felt. But then her expression softened. "Jace," she said, her voice a little quieter than usual. "What brings you here?" He hadn't expected to be caught off guard. Jace had no clear answer to that question. He had come to check on her, to make sure she was all right, but he couldn't say that. It sounded too personal. Instead, he replied, "I was just thinking. Wanted to make sure you were doing okay after everything." Alicia looked at him for a moment, and he could see the wariness in her eyes. She wasn't used to having people check in on her, especially not in such a direct way. She stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. "Come in," she said, her voice carrying a quiet invitation. "I don't bite." Jace hesitated but stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The room was neat, but there was a faint air of tension around it, a heaviness that hung in the air like an unspoken word. The walls were lined with various pieces of technology and military documents, but there were also personal touches, a picture frame with a photo of her younger self, and a few small items that showed a more human side to the tough captain. It was a reminder that, despite her armor, Alicia was, in the end, only human. Alicia moved over to her desk and sat down, her eyes momentarily glancing toward the window, as if searching for something out there in the void of space. Jace stayed standing, unsure of what to do next. The silence between them grew thick, but Alicia broke it. "You don't have to be here, Jace," she said, her voice low. "You have your own work to do."
"I'm fine." Jace couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. There was a distance in her tone, a barrier that she was putting up without even realizing it.
He could sense it, but he couldn't leave. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to stay. Something inside him told him she needed someone even if she didn't know how to ask for it. "Just because you say you're fine doesn't mean you are," Jace replied gently, his eyes meeting hers.
We all carry burdens, Captain. You don't have to carry yours alone.
Alicia looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady.
"I don't need anyone to carry it with me," she said, her voice firm, but Jace could hear the hesitation beneath it. "This is my job." "I don't ask for help," Jace nodded. "But he didn't back down. That's what makes you so strong," he said quietly. "But it also makes you isolated."
"No one can bear everything alone. Not even you." The words hung in the air, unspoken but clear. There was a shift in the room, an uncomfortable silence that neither of them seemed willing to break. But just as Jace was about to speak again, something unexpected happened. Alicia stood up quickly, as though the words they had exchanged were too much to bear. She walked to the window, her back to Jace. "I didn't ask for this life," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper.
"I didn't ask to be in charge, but it's the life I have now."
"And I don't know how to do anything else." Jace stayed where he was, letting her words settle in. He could feel the weight of her confession, the raw honesty behind it. For the first time, he saw her not as the captain, not as the leader of the Nebula Star, but as a person who had been carrying the weight of everyone's survival for too long, and now, for the first time, was revealing a crack in her armor.
"Maybe you don't have to do it all by yourself," Jace said quietly. "Maybe that's the one thing you don't have to carry alone." Alicia didn't respond immediately.
She stood at the window, her arms folded across her chest, her gaze lost in the endless stars outside. Jace didn't know if she was hearing him, but he wasn't about to give up. Slowly, he moved to stand next to her. He wasn't sure what he was doing. but he felt an overwhelming urge to stay by her side, even if only in silence. For a long time they stood there, side by side, watching the stars pass by. Neither of them spoke. But in that moment, something changed. There was a shift in the air, a quiet understanding that passed between them. Elysia didn't need to say it out loud. Jace didn't need to ask for permission. But something unspoken had been acknowledged. Finally, Elysia spoke again, her voice softer than it had been before. "I'm not used to this," she admitted, her gaze still on the stars.
I don't know how to ask for help, but I think I need it.
Jace nodded, his voice gentle.
You don't have to ask.
"We're all in this together."
Yeah.
And in that moment, Elysia realized that maybe, just maybe it was the strength to admit when you needed others. And maybe, just maybe, Jace had been right all along. She didn't have to carry the burden alone. She glanced at him, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Elysia, it was the first time in a long while that she had allowed herself to feel a little less burdened by the weight of command. For Jace, it was a quiet victory. He hadn't expected anything more than the chance to show that he cared. But in that moment, he realized that even the strongest people had their limits. And sometimes, it took someone else to remind them of that. As they stood together, the stars outside the window shining softly in the distance, neither of them spoke again. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer heavy with unspoken words, but filled with a mutual understanding. And though the journey ahead would be filled with dangers and challenges, Elysia knew that she wasn't truly alone. She had a crew, she had Jace, and perhaps, for the first time in a long time, she had the courage to face the future with someone by her side. The nebula star floated in the vast, dark expanse of space, its engines humming steadily as it drifted through the cold, silent void. The stars around them seemed endless, their distant light offering a quiet sense of calm amidst the chaos of their mission. The crew, despite the recent battle, had regained some of their usual routines. The ship was still being repaired, but the threat had passed for now. The quiet hum of the ship was a welcome change after the constant tension. But for Captain Elysia, the calm was temporary. She knew that the peace they had gained was fragile. The unknown enemy, the one who had attacked them before, was still out there. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. She had seen enough in her years as a leader to understand that when things seemed too quiet, it was often a sign of something dangerous on the horizon. As she stood on the bridge of the nebula star, her eyes fixed on the view screen ahead, her thoughts were a whirlwind. The ship had taken damage during the attack, but that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was the unknown, the identity of their enemies, their motives, and what they might do next.
Elysia couldn't help but feel the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her.
As captain, it was her job to keep the crew safe, to make the decisions that would ensure their survival. But it wasn't easy, especially when she had no answers. Jace was on the bridge with her, working quietly at his station. He had been more than just the technician these past few days. He had become an unexpected ally. The bond that had started to form between them in Elysia's quarters had only grown stronger. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, but Jace had earned her trust. He was calm under pressure, sharp when it mattered, and always there when needed.
Captain, Jace said, his voice breaking through her thoughts, we finished the repairs on the ship's outer hull.
But there's something strange. We've detected an unusual energy signature just outside the system.
It doesn't match anything we've encountered before. Elysia turned toward him, her brow furrowed.
How long until it reaches us? Less than an hour, Jace replied, his fingers flying over the controls. We'll have to prepare for another possible engagement. Elysia's heart sank. The unknown was closing in. It was happening again. She could feel the tension building in her chest, but she didn't let it show. As captain, she had to remain calm, collected. "Get the crew ready," she ordered. "Prepare for battle." The crew had already been through one attack, and though the ship had taken a beating, they had fought back with everything they had. But this time, it was different. The enemy they had faced was relentless, and there was no telling if they would come with the same force. Alicia couldn't afford to take any chances. As Jace worked on his console, Alicia couldn't help but think back to their earlier conversation. Jace had seen something in her, something she hadn't wanted anyone to see. The cracks beneath the armor she wore, the loneliness, the burden of leadership. But that vulnerability had also allowed her to see him in a new light. He was no longer just the technician who fixed her armor. He was someone who understood, someone she could rely on. In the moments of quiet between battles, she found herself thinking about him more than she should. It was a distraction she couldn't afford, but she couldn't help it.
"Captain," Jace's voice broke through her thoughts again. "We've got a visual on the enemy ship."
"It's huge, bigger than anything we've faced before." Alicia's gaze snapped to the view screen. In the distance, a massive shadow loomed. It was like nothing she had ever seen. Its sleek, dark shape was both beautiful and terrifying. The ship was clearly advanced, with weapons capable of dealing significant damage. "What are they waiting for?" Alicia muttered to herself.
"I don't think they're waiting," Jace said grimly. "They're moving into firing range."
The alert alarm blared through the ship. It was time. The crew quickly moved into action, each person taking their place. The Nebula Star was built for speed and agility, but it wasn't as heavily armed as their enemy. Still, Alicia knew that if they were going to survive, they needed to be smart. Every move had to count.
"Brace for impact!"
Alicia shouted over the intercom.
"This is it." The enemy ship opened fire, and the Nebula Star shook violently as the first blast hit the shields. Sparks flew from the console, and Alicia could feel the vibrations run through her body.
Her mind raced as she quickly assessed the situation. They were under heavy fire, but the shields were holding, for now.
"Shields at 50%, Jace reported, his voice calm despite the chaos. "We need to take evasive maneuvers or we won't last long." Alicia's heart pounded, but she didn't hesitate. "Helm, evasive maneuvers. Full speed ahead. Jace, focus on weapons. Get us a shot."
The ship shuddered again as another blast struck their hull. The crew was working as one, each person doing their part, their focus unwavering. Alicia's mind was sharp, her instincts kicking in. This was what she was born to do: lead, fight, and protect.
"Firing!"
Jace called out, his fingers dancing over the controls. The Nebula Star's weapons fired in quick succession, striking the enemy ship. But their attacks barely seemed to make a dent in the massive hull. The enemy ship retaliated, sending a barrage of fire that rocked the Nebula Star to its core. Alicia clenched her fists, her jaw tight with determination. They needed to find a weakness, something they could exploit. She glanced at Jace, who was still focused, his eyes scanning the enemy ship's surface. "I found it," Jace said suddenly, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and urgency. "There's a weak spot on their port side. Small, but it could be enough." "Get us in range," Alicia ordered without hesitation.
"We're not out of this yet."
The ship rocked again, but Alicia held her ground, her hands gripping the console as the crew worked together to avoid another blast. The enemy ship was relentless, but they weren't going to give up. Not while Alicia was still standing. "Steady," Alicia muttered to herself as the Nebula Star angled toward the enemy ship's weak spot. The crew worked in perfect harmony as they pushed their ship to its limits. The Nebula Star shuddered under the force of the next hit, but Alicia refused to look away. She couldn't. Not now.
"Now!"
Jace shouted. The Nebula Star fired, the shot hitting the weak spot with pinpoint accuracy. The enemy ship's shields flickered and then collapsed under the pressure. There was a moment of silence, a breath held in anticipation. Then, the enemy ship retaliated, firing a final blast. Alicia watched as the blast approached. It would hit them head-on, and there was no way to avoid it. But in that instant, she didn't think of the danger, didn't think of the cost. She thought of her crew. She thought of Jace, standing there beside her, focused and calm. "Jace," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. "Prepare to fire the last shot." Jace nodded, his fingers moving swiftly over the controls. The final shot was fired, and the blast hit the enemy ship's core. There was a moment of hesitation, then a blinding explosion as the enemy ship erupted into flames, its hull disintegrating in space. The nebula star was rocked by the shockwave, but they had done it. They had won. Alicia slumped back in her seat, the tension leaving her body all at once. She was exhausted, every muscle aching from the strain of the battle. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins, but it was slowly fading, leaving her with a deep, bone-tired exhaustion. She had done it. They had done it. The bridge fell silent for a moment. And then, slowly, the crew began to cheer, a loud, relieved sound that filled the room. Alicia let the sound wash over her, but her thoughts turned to Jace. He had been by her side through it all. Focused, calm, and strong. She glanced at him, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to relax. "We did it," she said, her voice quiet but full of pride. Jace turned to her, his expression soft. "We did," he said, his voice equally quiet. "Together." In that moment, Alicia realized something she had known all along, but had never truly acknowledged. She wasn't alone. She had her crew, she had Jace, and together, they could face whatever came next. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. The future was uncertain, but Alicia knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to face it alone.